Strength Chat episode 7, and I've got a guest today, Lawrence Farncombe. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good. Thank you for having me on your show.
Not a problem. Thanks a lot for getting in touch with me. So first of all, if you could just do a little bit of an introduction.
Yep. If you don't know me, which you might not. My name's Lawrence Farncombe, aka Strength Coach Farncombe. I've been in powerlifting for nearly 20 years now, first as a competitor and then pretty soon after a coach. In this time, I've been head coach for GB from 2015 to 2018, coached 8 international teams, was lucky enough to play a very big role, I guess, in some of the best performances in the history of British powerlifting to date. Obviously, that was a combination of myself and lots of other help from other coaches and managers, and obviously none of it would be possible without the amazing lifters themselves.
Yeah. So
lots of credit to them as always. And I guess I'm best known for pissing people off and for consecutively producing good quality lifters to international standards. I've got a good track record of that, and I've been doing it for many, many years. And I won't bore you anymore with rubbishy credentials and stuff like that. You know, I think there's more value in looking at what people have achieved than looking at credentials any day of the week. So that's kind of me summing it up for you.
Yeah. So we'll be in safe hands listening to some of the things you've got to say then. So the topic I want to really cover today is a lot of people are quite happy in the build up to a competition, in the training that they need to do, but in that couple of weeks between competitions, is there such a thing as an off season in powerlifting? Is there training that you should be focusing on between competitions, between meet prep?
Yeah. I think in the conventional sense of an off season, I think obviously powerlifting doesn't technically have an off season like other sports do, but I think that we do benefit from a transition phase, which technically is an off season. So the terminology wise, off season, you know, that depends. It depends on the lifter's classification. So in other words, I'll give you an example of that because it's quite a broad question, I think. For instance, if you were a novice lifter and you're making newbie gains and you happen to have really good structural balance, like your stabilizers, the synergists, those muscle groups that act as synergists, you're mechanically pretty good, then in reality, a lengthy off-season or time out might not actually be that beneficial. You might benefit far more from becoming a better competition lifter and doing competitions.
Yeah.
But I think as you go through it, if you're an intermediate, then you might need to spend more time, if you're classified as an intermediate, which I'll go into more detail later, but then you might need to spend more time focusing on your weak links and so forth. So that actually your off-season or your transition phase might need to be longer. And obviously with advanced lifters, that definitely wants to be longer. The amount of times they can put in elite level performances or near elite level is going to go down. But I think that's all going to come down to really you or your coach deciding what is the primary goals at the moment. I guess if I'm trying to sum it up, would be what are your needs? Yeah. Your classification, and of course what you and your coach or you have decided is your competition season. Yeah. And all of that is going to help build that picture about should you have time off, more time off, less time off, any time off. Yeah. Everyone benefits from some time off. That's a given.
Yeah, absolutely. So most of the people in the powerlifting club that I run are beginners and intermediates, and obviously the beginners are wanting to become intermediates, and intermediates are wanting to push on and become a little bit more advanced. How long would you sort of recommend a deloading training or a change in training to be, depending on that level?
Right. So again, I would try to classify. If I was running a club, which I don't. Hopefully soon I will be, but I don't, to be honest. I would classify. I would do what I've done in other sports when I've worked with multiple athletes. Okay, even though I do work with multiple athletes, because I'm basically paid to work with them individual. They pay me.
Yeah.
So then I look at everybody as an individual. But obviously, when you do it, when you've got a group of athletes and you're trying to get the best out of all of them, so this is my opinion, and a lot of people do it like in the sports science world, you know, or more importantly in the S&C world, is I would classify lifters. Have I got a lifter? I would try and create a classification where let's say I've got 3 groups of novice. One group is technically good, and they're effectively, like I said before, their structural balance is good as well. So I do tests to test that. So I'd say I'd send them all out and do all the same tests, all battery tests, and I'd say, you know what, this lifter's weak as piss in the frontal plane, or transverse plane, and in truth, I might be able to make them stronger, but is that really the right approach? Because I'm probably going to get them injured quick unless I can try and build the strength or build a good foundation to lay that strength on.
Yeah.
So I'd have a group that I would think, right, for that group, I want to have slightly less competitions and more time building a foundation.
Yeah.
Now, another group that actually might come from, let's say, a judo background, who have been used to, you know, or strongman or whatever, right? They've been used to multi-plane loading. They're very, very strong individuals, and you can see probably those people, the rate of progression will be very fast. But I haven't got to worry too much about them being weak within certain planes of movement, or their structural balance being, or their core strength, whatever it is, right? So for those people, I'd actually think, well, the biggest benefit for them is to get them in more competitions. So for them, depending on the background they came from, I might do less off-season or less of a transition phase, because often they're going to benefit more from just getting on the platform and becoming a better skilled competition lifter, because that is, you've got to build that as well. And then I'll have maybe another group, and I'm just firing it out there, that you know, that maybe, as an example, are very light in their weight class, and I need to spend a bit more time building muscle hypertrophy, fill them out and put some muscle, because they're skinny as a rake. Let's take young males as an example, right? So then I might think, well, actually, for me to truly do that, I can program the 2 things in and build strength because they're novices, but I might still want a little bit more of a transition phase. So I guess I would first try and analyse what the needs are of the lifter, and also what the chances of them competing at a national level or qualifying by the end of the year would determine the length of time. Effectively, we're really talking about periodization. Determine the length of time that I think I've got for focusing on a off-season, you know, transition phase as such. So unfortunately, I can't give you an exact answer. I can just give you a ballpark that it would depend on the needs. If I know that they're weak, you know, that they aren't very strong in their core, a lot of structural balance problems, like they've got weak rotator cuff musculature, they're very weak in frontal and transverse plane, I would do the right thing by the lifter and try and hold them back and spend more time developing those strength attributes that they need, that are ultimately going to keep them safe, stop them from getting injured, stop them from plateauing, and really enjoying the sport. Because my responsibility would be they've come to me and I'm trying to help these people out. So,
absolutely.
So I feel that I'm not being responsible if I didn't do that. I think the one thing that I didn't mention, which is just so fundamental to what I always preach, and people probably get bored of it, and I used to get hammered online about it, is technique is king. You know, what we're seeing right now is this really, really huge thing about, I don't want to say it because I don't want to put people down, but people think it's all about programming. They think it's just about programming. No, it's about technique. And those off-season transition phases can be also determined by how badly they technically lift.
Yeah. A big thing that we put in the club is, you know, I'm a big believer in powerlifting is all about efficient movement. If, you know, the bar's moving away from that line of efficient movement, then you're not going to be able to lift as much weight as what you can. So, you know, you've got to drill good technique. And just when you were saying about people coming from different backgrounds, there's a couple of people who have come from a strongman background that are wanting to do powerlifting, but they're not necessarily, like you're saying about getting them on the platform, they're not efficient enough or have the technique. They're really strong guys, but don't have the technique of doing the squat, bench, deadlift and getting the technique real in there. But then on the other side, there's a couple of guys that are a little bit smaller that I'll give a few more accessory exercises, if you like, just to bulk up a little bit, put a little bit more mass on. So yeah, at least that's from my point of view as a coach. At least that I'm heading in the right direction with that going forward. Yeah.
And remember, like I said, and this is the key point right now that we're all falling into the trap of, is programming is part of the parcel. So when we say programming, what a lot of people think of is they think about putting the right weight on the bar for the right amount of sets and the right amount of reps. That's only part of the picture. Don't think like that. That's a bad way to think.
Yeah.
Because if you do that, all you'll do is, if you program really, really well, respect to you, but all you'll do is you might get, that's my dog in the background. Not me, but I do snore. But all you'll get is, if you're lucky, or if you've done a great job, you might make them strong very, very quickly, but they'll also plateau quickly and get injured quickly. Yeah. Remember, when it comes to program, we need to take, as coaches or lifters, we need to take a more holistic approach and think about programming has to involve movement proficiency as well. Yeah. And this is, I saw a discussion the other day, and it was a good discussion. I thought, good, I'm glad people are talking about this, but they haven't put two and two together yet. It was an American blog at the time, but either way, and they were talking about why, the Russian lifters can work up to near max or maximals and their form doesn't break down. And they were saying how a lot of the Western lifters, their form really breaks down on their 1RMs or their near maxes. Yeah. And in truth, you know what? That's because ultimately, like I won't say his name, like he said correctly, was because they get them when they're very, very young, and therefore they install that movement proficiency. And ultimately, the lifter or the athlete realizes that if they go outside, like you just talked about earlier, outside of that optimal position, actually the amount of force they've got to generate to move that bar, which, is increased. Therefore, they're at risk of injury. So that they become very good. And I think, even though I program like percentages and RPEs and RIRs, myself, so I auto-regulate, I do think that at the same time, always working up with auto-regulation means that in some ways we're always working at the higher end of when the movement can break down, unless you've programmed very, very sensibly and you auto-regulate very, very sensibly. So the problem is, sometimes what's best to gain, to make you lift more might not be best long-term. And therefore, what I always say, and I'll say it again, and people get bored of me saying it, is, look, listen, what is really powerlifting? Powerlifting is this. When it comes right down to it, powerlifting, if we're going to put it into a box, is about effectively creating the most biomechanically efficient blueprint to activate or recruit the most amount of muscle while achieving the least range of movement to accomplish the sport. That's what it is in a nutshell. To recruit from the biggest, strongest muscle group. We want to do the least range of movement, and we want to, at the same time, we have to accommodate the rules of the sport, because obviously if we go a quarter squat, it doesn't count. But however that model looks depends on your anthropometry. You know what I mean? So ultimately, as a coach or lifters, our goal is to chase that in if we're going to be successful long term. Because what you do see is you see a lot of people programming, making great gains initially, but what happens is they keep getting re-injured because they weren't chasing movement proficiency as part of the programming strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Movement sort of overrides anything. There's a trainer that works in the gym that I'm at, and she's quite big on movement. And she so I have really bad hip mobility, and that was really making my squat struggle. A few tweaks on that, and then boom, my squat absolutely shot up. Movement is a big thing, which is what we put in the powerlifting club before. So when they come in, right, get your movement done, then we can start going into the session. So you touched on it. sort of in the transition period of, if someone's got a weak core or something like that, within that transition period, would you recommend focusing on one weakness or the main weakness, or would you go down the route of, right, let's throw a couple of exercises out there and focus on a couple of weaknesses that they may have?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, if I'm honest about that, coming from an S&C background, I would approach it like that, So, when you're training athletes in all sports, generally speaking, like an old school approach to it, but still holds true to today, would be you would have your main focus and then you'd have a secondary focus.
Yeah.
So, if you were, let's just say, somebody that, I don't know, that was light in their weight class, but you're still looking at, and it's a tricky one, they're technically quite poor, you'd be looking at, obviously, maybe your first thing, in my opinion, technique would be your overriding thing, and then you'd be looking at trying to hypertrophy, so that would be a secondary quality that maybe you're chasing, or biomotor, what I mean, ability. So that would kind of sum that up for me when it comes down to, I don't think you can try and do everything. That's a poor thing, because your body has to be exposed to the same thing repetitively, and a good example of that is, if I'm going to expand on it, let's say I'm chasing a couple of different qualities. Let's just say strength, right?
Yeah.
Let's just say I'm trying to build muscle. Okay, I'm trying to build strength. I'm also maybe trying to be explosive. Let's pretend it's another sport, right?
Yeah.
So, because we don't really care about that, but either way, my point being that if I go in one session and all I do is hypertrophy, or let's say I do worse, I go in there and I do hypertrophy, a bit of hypertrophy, a bit of like Olympic lifting, explosive, dynamic stuff, and then I also do a bit of strength work. What have I really tried to get out of my body? Just, if I look at it from learning perspective and adaptation, it's like me going to an hour or 2 hour lesson where I learned Spanish, I learned German and Japanese. My body's going to struggle to I'm going to struggle to retain any of that. And if it comes down to hitting different things, now obviously things like DUP will help, because you might spend a focus, one session on this, one session on that quality and another on that, and overall they lead, because you focus slightly more on the strength aspect or the technique aspect. Overall they are focal, they're I guess sequentially organised so that they're targeting your main goal, whatever it is, and then you've got a secondary goal. So I think anyway, for me personally, to answer the question straight, which I never do because I'm like a politician, what I would do is I would focus on one main thing and have a secondary thing. Maybe with something, a third thing in the background, a third quality that I'm targeting in the background. But I don't think you want to be doing more than sort of 1 to 2 main things. If you're doing more than that, your chances are you'll adapt to nothing. Yeah.
So would that be a move, as just on back to if it's for powerlifting, would it be changing the lifts that you're doing? So a common thing that I see is people's chests falling forward in their squat. So would you say, right, we're going to focus on the front squat for 4 weeks and get stronger in that position and then go back to back squatting? Or would you go from maybe a low bar to a high bar squat? How would you sort of, in the programming sense, go down that route?
Right. Okay. So for me, there's two questions there, even though it was actually only one asked. First thing is, in a chest ball pattern, unfortunately, most people are incorrect. Not always. Sometimes they're right. By only chasing what they think is the problem. They're looking at the problem, but not really the cause.
Okay.
So it's what you call pacification. So in other words, for instance, a lot of the time, chest ball pattern, the mistake happens, and it's a technical problem, happens in the eccentric. It's not actually that much of a strength deficit until over a long period of time, you end up chest ball. It's a bit like the chicken and the egg. Okay. The strength deficit happens after the movement pattern has broke down in the eccentric. So anyway, my point being, I guess that I'm trying to make with that is, if, for instance, someone's got a chest ball pattern in the squat, first I'll analyse why it's happening. Is it the fact that they're not opening up the hip angle enough when they're opening up the knee angle, so you get a chest ball pattern happen?
Yeah.
Is it maybe that sometimes the quads are the limiting factor, that people might think that's it? But in most cases, normally the problem is in the eccentric, like I said before. But what happens is the bar is rather trailing behind midfoot, or the knees are too far back, and then everything's behind midfoot, the mass. So when they hit depth, everything shunts forwards. So the moment they do that, they turn down, the hips come under you, the knees go forward. So you get what's called a knee shunt.
Mm-hmm.
So once that knee shunt, or knee slide, some people call it, once that knee slide happens, the hips are under you, the knee angle becomes very, very close. But you get the stretch shortening cycle happen, so that the knee angle will open up very, very quickly, and it has to happen because it has to do that to maintain the mass over the midfoot.
Okay.
So then what you have is that opens up too quick, and then your hips shoot back and creates a chest ball pattern to make sure that the bar is staying over midfoot. And then effectively you've opened the knee angle in the correct timing, and then you've still got a closed hip angle, so therein lies your problem. You've got a chest ball pattern. So the first thing I do is analyse why they've got a chest ball pattern. And then the next thing would be, okay, if you were chasing out a chest ball pattern, actually, give me that question again. Sorry, Steve. So the question was, somebody has a chest ball pattern.
Yeah, would you use a front squat, or go from to load it at the front to stop your chest falling forward, or would you go from low bar to high bar squat?
Low bar. That was your question.
Yeah, from low bar to high bar, yeah.
Right, from up, right. Yeah, okay, so to answer that exact question, first I'd analyse why it's happening in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing I would do is, I would say the problem with that, with going from a front, for your original question, going from a front squat, if that was my what I've analysed to be the problem, and that's going to help combat that problem, would I do a front squat and then swap back? No, because in reality, the problem with just that, unless it's an incredibly long transition phase or off season, was by the time they put the ball back on their back, if let's say you're doing front squat twice a week, you're not doing any low bar squat, so then it again goes into how you're organising that training frequency, that microcycle, and basically your training pattern. But I wouldn't do that. Simply, for me personally, I'd always try and train in the specific movement, and if it meant going lighter, so I didn't see the chest ball pattern, and then add in the front squat, if I felt that was the fix, the front squat as the back off or the assistant exercise, then that's what I would do. I would keep the back squat going, so it's technically good. So if that meant deloading it, I would deload the hell of it, so it was technically correct. So I'm still doing that movement. It's kind of like, hey, if I was a football player, if football's not going well, I'm not going to go and play rugby and then come back to football. It's not specific enough. So even though that might be the fix, that football player is just a bit of a pussy and needs toughening up, so going to rugby is the right choice for that individual. But either way, I would keep the main movement in, but then I would do whatever I felt was the most appropriate assistant exercise to build the strength in the muscle groups that are the limiting factor. If I've analysed the weakness in the muscles are the limiting factor, and it's not actually the movement proficiency itself.
Yeah, I think with when people come to the powerlifting club, they think straight away that we're gonna just test 1 rep maxes every single session. But going back to the point that you made, it is about technique and drilling good technique. And if that means taking weight off the bar a little bit and making sure that you're doing it properly, sometimes you have to take a couple of steps back to take 3 steps forward.
And you know what? If they desperately want hammer them on the stuff that doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
The technique breaks down a bit. It's an assistant exercise. As long as it's not transferring back to the main movement, then great. And again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about programming. It's only part of the parcel. If you're thinking of programming being sets, weights, and reps, that's 50%, my friend. Do you know what I mean? I'm not saying to you, but you get my point. Yeah,
absolutely. So we covered quite a few bits on there. So from to sort of sum up for the people that will be listening, what would be your top 3 tips to take away really for for that transitional period for if you're not building up to a competition?
Yeah, so I guess to put that into context exactly, my tips would be this. First, understand your limiting factors. What are they? Try and build a picture, right? That's my first one. The next thing is, obviously, understand your classification. What are you? Are you a novice, intermediate? Because that's all going to affect the length of time, potentially, that you might need off. I mean, I've had so many lifters. Recently, one of my better lifters, was trying to do so many competitions, and I was like, I didn't want him to do them, and I said it's going to hurt you because it takes longer to build the quality up, and also to build that peak to really hit those big numbers.
Yeah.
So classify. Try and understand your classification, and that, I guess, sorry to go on a little bit more.
No.
That's got with how you program. If you're a novice, and for me, classification's got nothing to do with the weight on the bar and everything to do with how you make gains.
Yeah.
So if you're someone that can just have a almost linear progression, you're probably a novice.
Mm-hmm.
If you're someone that is, let's say, an intermediate, and you need to train slightly different qualities within a week, you're probably an intermediate, right?
Yeah.
And you can't just go up the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fall to bits. And this is just phenomenally simple generalisation, but it's still quite true. And if you're an advanced lifter, it's months before you can stick 5 kilos extra on the bar.
Yeah.
2.5. It might take you, months to achieve that. And actually, if you did that, then all respect to you, because you're at the elite level.
Yeah.
So 5 kilo improvement over 3 months, you've done bloody well.
Yeah. Well, that's why I say to the people in the powerlifting club, that's why world records are breaking by 1 kilos, 0.5 kilos. Like, it's not, you're not gonna ever have a world record smashed by 10 kilos. It's just it's unrealistic.
It's unusual, yeah, and especially now that the sport's developing so fast,
Mm-hmm.
everybody, you've got elite level people that's no longer the case. So that would be my first. So just to recap, my first is needs. What are your needs? What are your limiting factors? My second is what classification are you? Because that will depend on the time, your transition period, that so-called off season. If you were in another sport, maybe that is the off season annually, and it will also affect your annual training plan. And thirdly, would be your training plan, as in what have you and your coach or you decided that what is your year going to look like?